It did not begin with shouting crowds or collapsing walls. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in kitchens, classrooms, factories, and cramped apartments spread across Eastern Europe. Long before the world watched concrete crumble in Berlin, the Iron Curtain had already started to fail in a far more dangerous way. People stopped believing in it. This is the story not of a single night or a single leader, but of a slow, silent collapse that unfolded throughout the 1980s, unnoticed by many, underestimated by most, and unstoppable once it reached a certain point. For decades, the Iron Curtain was presented as permanent. It was not only a physical division of borders, barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards, but a mental boundary reinforced by fear, propaganda, and repetition. Citizens on the eastern side were taught from childhood that history had reached its final and correct form. Capitalism was depicted as chaotic, cruel, unstable, and morally bankrupt. The West, they were told, was rotting beneath the surface, while socialism represented progress, justice, and inevitability. For a long time, many accepted this story, not because it was convincing, but because questioning it carried consequences. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, however, daily life was quietly undermining ideology. The promised future never arrived. Factories aged, infrastructure decayed, and shortages became routine. People learned to live with empty shelves, long lines, ration cards, and unofficial networks to obtain basic goods. This was not rebellion, it was survival. Yet survival has a way of sharpening perception. Ordinary citizens began to notice that the sacrifices demanded by the system were endless, while the rewards were abstract and always postponed. What made the 1980s different was comparison. Information began to leak through the cracks. Western radio broadcasts reached living rooms late at night. Television signals crossed borders. Relatives traveled when permitted and returned with stories that contradicted official narratives. Western magazines, music, films, and consumer goods circulated quietly, illegally, or semi-legally. These were not revolutionary pamphlets. They were something far more corrosive. Evidence. Evidence that life elsewhere looked easier, fuller, and more dignified. Evidence that ordinary people in the West did not live in constant fear or deprivation. This realization did not spark instant rebellion. It sparked something more dangerous to an authoritarian system: doubt. People began asking private questions they never voiced publicly. Why did other societies seem to function without secret police? Why were their shelves full while ours were bare? Why were we told we lived in a superior system when so much of our daily energy was spent compensating for its failures? These questions spread silently, from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to child. Across Eastern Europe, each country experienced this erosion differently, but the pattern was unmistakable. In Poland, workers who had been declared the backbone of socialism realized they were being asked to sacrifice endlessly while remaining powerless. The solidarity movement emerged not from abstract ideology, but from practical frustration, rooted in shipyards and factories where promises no longer matched reality. Even when suppressed, the idea that collective obedience was optional never fully disappeared. In Hungary, limited economic reforms exposed an uncomfortable truth. Once small freedoms were allowed, people wanted more. Controlled openness only highlighted how restrictive the system truly was. In Czechoslovakia, intellectuals, students, and artists circulated banned texts and held quiet discussions that questioned not just policy, but legitimacy. These conversations were rarely dramatic. They were thoughtful, restrained, and persistent. And persistence, over time, is devastating to rigid systems. East Germany presented one of the clearest examples of the silent collapse. Officially, it was a successful socialist state. Unofficially, millions knew that life just across the border offered greater opportunity and personal freedom. Those who could leave did. Those who could not waited. They waited with patience, with resignation, and eventually with quiet determination. When the chance finally came, the decision had already been made long before the cameras arrived. Meanwhile, within the Soviet Union itself, the center holding the entire structure together, the same forces were at work. The leadership understood that the system was stagnating, but underestimated how deeply belief had already eroded. Reforms like glasnost and perestroika were meant to preserve socialism by modernizing it. Instead, they exposed its weaknesses. Once people were allowed to speak more openly, they spoke honestly. Once they could compare narratives, they chose reality over ideology. What makes this collapse remarkable is how little violence preceded it. There were no mass uprisings for most of the decade, no sweeping military confrontations. Instead, there was a gradual withdrawal from belief itself. People continued to follow routines, attend meetings, and repeat expected phrases. But the conviction behind them was gone. Obedience became mechanical, loyalty performative. The system still existed outwardly, yet inwardly it was already hollow. This quiet loss of faith was more dangerous than open rebellion because it spread unnoticed and could not be easily suppressed. Party membership slowly lost meaning. For many, it became a formality rather than a commitment. Younger generations joined for practical reasons. Older ones remained out of habit, but few believed in the future being promised. Informal networks replaced institutions, as people relied on friends and family to navigate shortages and bureaucracy. Trust shifted away from the state and toward personal relationships, quietly weakening centralized authority. Western media and culture accelerated this erosion. Radio broadcasts, television signals, music, films, and consumer goods offered glimpses of a different way of life. They did not preach revolution, they simply showed alternatives. Over time, these comparisons made official narratives harder to accept. As economic stagnation deepened and reforms exposed systemic flaws, belief could not be restored. By the time public demonstrations appeared, the decision had already been made in private. The Iron Curtain collapsed not in violence, but in disbelief, undone by years of silent recognition that the system no longer made sense. As economic stagnation deepened and reforms attempted to fix visible problems, they instead revealed deeper structural failures. Limited openness allowed people to speak more honestly, and once that honesty emerged, it could not be contained again. The idea that the system merely needed adjustment lost credibility. What had once felt permanent now seemed fragile, even temporary. By the time public demonstrations appeared, the decision had already been made in private. Fear had been worn down by years of silent evaluation. The Iron Curtain collapsed not in violence, but in disbelief, undone by years of quiet recognition that the system no longer made sense. What followed was not chaos, but a collective release, as millions realized that the barrier dividing their lives from the wider world had already disappeared in their minds. The physical structures fell only after the psychological ones had vanished, confirming that the most decisive revolutions often occur long before they are visible to history.